When I first decided that I was going to do a marathon of Sony Pictures Animation, I wasn't really sure what I was getting into. As far as I'm aware, this studio isn't really much of a household name, and doesn't really have much of a distinct flavor, unlike Disney or Pixar or to some degree DreamWorks. When discussing any of their movies, I feel like most people, even people who are into film and animation, have to be told which studio made it. It's not like I was personally all that familiar with them either. I didn't grow up with any of their movies too closely. I think the only ones I actually saw as a kid were the Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs movies and the first, two-thirds of Hotel Transylvania. More recently, I saw Surf's Up and Spider-Verse, but that's it. 4 and a fraction, out of 28. So now, after sitting through them all, the vast majority of them for the first time, if there's one conclusion I took away from this marathon, it's this. Sony Pictures Animation may have made the Spider-Verse movies, but they've made a hell of a lot of crap as well. For this video, I've decided to put a little number in the corner of the screen, indicating the score out of 10 I gave whichever movie I'm currently talking about. In a second, when I talk about the movie I ranked on the bottom, it's going to start at 1, and throughout the video, I want you to pay attention to just how slowly that number goes up. Number 28. Open Season 2. I've already made an entire video about how I think Open Season is quite possibly the worst animated film franchise of all time, so I'm going to be very general in my points. It has some of the ugliest character designs ever created, it has some of the most annoying characters ever written, it has some of the worst jokes ever told, it has some of the worst voice performances I've ever heard, and on top of everything else, it fundamentally fails at what it's trying to be, in that it really wants to have this wacky and exciting tone, but it's just too tame. It's also slow-paced, some of the characters sound like they're sleepwalking through the entire movie, and even on a conceptual level, most of the set pieces just aren't interesting. Of course something from this franchise was going to rank on the bottom, it was only a question of which one. And ultimately, I decided that the second movie was my least favorite, mostly because of the deer. I think he's a terrible protagonist in pretty much all of the movies, but this second one is easily where he's at his worst. It's like they tried to write him as a character who's supposed to be annoying and unlikable in-universe, and that's where the humor is supposed to come from, but he never brings anything interesting out of the rest of the cast, which is basically essential for this type of character to work. And as such, all of his scenes are just really grating, and this may sound hyperbolic, but honestly kind of difficult to sit through. This movie not only ranks on the bottom of Sony's catalog, but it might be my least favorite animated movie of all time. There are Video Brinkado bootleg movies that I prefer to Open Season 2. Number 27. Surf's Up 2, Wave Mania. I don't know if I have ever seen a sequel that missed the point of the first movie harder than this one did. Like, beyond all the other ways it's a bad follow-up, such as the significantly worse voice acting, and the fact that it doesn't progress anything at all, with Cody's arc in this one just being a shitty repeat of his arc from the first movie, thematically it misses the point. They completely retcon Cody's backstory and say that his goal all along was to join this surf team or something, consisting of a bunch of characters who were never even mentioned in the original, with Big Z and the first movie's anti-idolization themes basically being forgotten about. Stylistically, it misses the point. The first movie was a mockumentary, and that presentation choice is pretty much completely abandoned in this one. Okay, to be utterly fair, once every 20 minutes a character will look at the screen and say some dumb shit, but the naturalistic dialogue, the camera existing as a physical object in the scene, the cameraman himself sometimes being a character in the story, all of that's gone. And this is kind of entering nitpicky territory, but the movie even gets some pretty basic facts about the story and world of the first movie wrong. They act like Pengu is this rink-a-dink island where nothing ever happens, when the first movie established it as the surf capital of the world. They also act like Cody is from there, when he obviously isn't. It comes across like whoever was behind the decision-making for this movie didn't even watch the original. Really though, I shouldn't even be criticizing this movie as a follow-up to Surf's Up. It's pretty obvious the only reason it exists is to be a promo tool for the WWE. And I have to say, it does a pretty shit job at being that as well. The WWE people are all not very good voice actors, and their designs are all pretty bad. They're way too anthropomorphized and look really out of place in the Surf's Up universe, but most importantly, they're just really dull characters. They have absolutely no chemistry with each other or the rest of the cast, and their dialogue is all the most generic, preschool-level teamwork advice you've ever heard. They completely rely on the audience going, "Oh, it's that person I know from the show where they play fight in weird costumes." And I don't watch the WWE and never have, so this does nothing for me. The only memorable thing about them is that Vince McMahon's character has this really bizarre recurring gag where he constantly fantasizes about drinking milk from a fish. Like, what? What the fuck is that? Is this a WWE reference that I don't get? Is this Vince McMahon's real-life fantasy that he decided to put into this children's movie? Forget all that shit with Star Wars, start a petition to strike this movie from the Surf's Up canon. Number 26. Open Season 3. To be honest, I basically have nothing to say about 3 that I didn't already say about 2. It's just another straight-to-DVD sequel to an already pretty shit theatrical release, with all of the same problems that the second movie had. I guess it's a pretty marginal improvement over its predecessor, primarily because the deer, as well as that Crispin Glover puffball dog, who I would consider to be the second most annoying character in this series, are both in it a lot less, and have basically no relevance to the plot this time round. But at this point, we're basically comparing a puddle of diarrhea to a slightly smaller puddle of diarrhea. You don't have to choose between them, you can just avoid them both. Number 25. The Emoji Movie. Yes, The Emoji Movie. One of the most universally hated animated movies ever made. The movie that was the laughingstock of the entire year it came out. Is only the 4th worst movie this studio has produced. It's only the 2nd worst one that came out that year. Because The Emoji Movie is really bad, but aside from the beyond parody level premise, and the fact that it continues James Corden's honestly impressive track record of starring in so many of the most universally hated movies ever made, there's nothing interesting about it. It's just a complete nothing burger of a movie. The animation and the designs of everything are both really bland. The world seems like it has no thought put into it whatsoever. Several scenes are pretty much just 5-minute ads for an app. Every beat the story hits just feels like they're going through a checklist. The writing sounds like a string of Facebook memes and fortune cookie quotes. I normally don't like this descriptor, but if there's any movie in existence that feels like it was AI generated, it's this one. And I feel like putting any more thought into it would just be a waste of time. Number 24. Goosebumps 2: Haunted Halloween. This was easily the most bored I was during this entire marathon. Very briefly, near the beginning, it seemed like they might do something mildly interesting with the plot, having these kids find the magical dummy from the first movie and maybe start abusing his powers, but no. They find out pretty much right away that he's evil, and then the remaining hour of runtime is just a bunch of mediocre teen actors running in circles around a suburban neighborhood while being chased by a bunch of generic CG monsters. And it looks like a Nickelodeon TV movie. I really wish I had more to say than that, but there just isn't anything to it. It's basically a live-action Scooby-Doo chase scene, except 90 minutes long. Numbers 23 and 22. The live-action Smurfs movies. Yeah, they're right next to each other in the ranking, and there's not really a whole lot that distinguishes them from one another, so might as well talk about them both at once. Really though, what even is there to say about these? Every single one of these movies about some cartoon character winding up in the real world are exactly the same. They all begin with that same joke where they and the human lead first meet each other and both scream. They all have the same humor where the human lead is annoyed by the cartoon characters because of their cartoony gimmicks and the fact that they don't understand basic things about the real world. And why does every movie like this dedicate a massive chunk of the runtime to a paint-by-numbers story about how boring white guy number 85 million has to get a promotion at his job, or reconcile with some girlfriend or family member, or some other dumb shit that has nothing to do with the advertised premise of the movie? Like, oh my god, in the first one especially, why is this taken so seriously? He's making an ad for a fictional makeup company. The movie is supposed to be about the Smurfs going on an adventure in the real world. At least focus more on that, that's what anybody watching is actually there to see. However, therein lies another problem. The Smurfs have always been hyper-simplistic characters by design. They literally have names like Brainy, Grouchy, Clumsy, etc., and were only written with the intent of being used in episodic short stories, so it's kind of difficult to find enough for them to do in a feature-length movie. I mean, the Smurf plot in the second movie is basically just an extended retelling of one of the episodes of the 80s cartoon. I guess that answers my own question. This is probably why they feel they have to pad the runtime out with boring Neil Patrick Harris. They also don't really have much of a presence in any scene they're in. They move around really weightlessly, and none of the live actors seem to have that great an idea of what they're interacting with. It makes the already pretty poor premise even more difficult to buy into. The exact ranking order of these two doesn't matter that much, but if I had to put one over the other, I'd say the first one is a tiny bit better. That child actor in the second movie was really awful. Number 21. Open Season. The one that started it all, both for this franchise and for this entire studio. And if you're expecting me to have a whole lot new to say about this open season movie, compared to the two that I've already talked about in this video, well, frankly, I have no idea why you were expecting that. It has all of the same problems as the second and third movies, but to a somewhat lesser degree, so that it's less painful and more just really, really boring. The animation is a bit more polished, since this one was actually a theatrical release, but the designs are so conceptually poor that hardly even matters. Every joke is just a character farting, shitting, or speaking in an accent that isn't an American accent, and the voice acting for the two main characters might actually be worse than it is in the straight-to-DVD sequels. Martin Lawrence is especially bad. I don't know if I've ever witnessed someone underact harder than he does in this movie. If there's one proper positive this one has over 2 and 3, I guess the villain has a few okay moments, but even if he were an utterly fantastic villain, it's not like he has that much screen time. If I were to give a one-sentence review for this entire franchise, I would say, just watch Over the Hedge instead. Number 20. Goosebumps. You can just repeat a lot of what I said about its sequel. I do think this one is a bit better by virtue of having a plot where things happen. Having the writer of Goosebumps be a character in the story and making it a sort of meta-narrative about the appeal of the Goosebumps books was an idea. And that might have meant a lot more to me if I was actually familiar with Goosebumps at all, which I'm not. However, in execution, the characters are all still really dull and annoying. It still looks like a Nickelodeon TV movie. It's still really poorly paced, the majority of the runtime is still mediocre teen actors running away from generic CG monsters, and this dummy, I guess he's a really famous Goosebumps character or something, because they make him the leader of the monsters and he's given a lot more attention than the others, but I don't think he's a very good villain, to be honest. We never really get a good gauge of what he's actually capable of. He kinda just seems to be omnipotent. He can teleport anywhere, he can spawn whatever he wants, and in both movies, whenever they manage to defeat him, it doesn't feel earned. I'm just wondering why he isn't using his seemingly infinite power in those moments. Also, from a franchise perspective, I do find it very strange that it ends on a tease for a sequel, but then when they actually made a sequel, it was about something totally unrelated. Number 19. Smurfs: The Lost Village. This is not related to the live-action movies in any way. This is a full-on reboot that came out less than 5 years after the previous series ended. Sony kind of has a history of doing this sort of thing. I don't have a whole lot new to say about this one. It's less ugly because it's fully animated in a style somewhat reminiscent of the original cartoon. It's slightly less boring because it doesn't dedicate a massive chunk of the plot to boring Neil Patrick Harris. And Azrael is less terrifying because they're not CGing exaggerated expressions onto a real cat, but the story is just a retelling of the story of the second live-action movie from only a few years earlier, which itself was just a retelling of the episode of the cartoon where they show Smurfette's origin story. Can they not think of anything else to do with this property? I get that the Smurfs are really simple characters by design, and that Smurfette's origin story is, as far as I'm aware, one of the only actual arcs that any of them have ever had, but maybe that's a sign that you shouldn't be making feature-length movies about them. I do have to say though, there is one point the live-action movies get over this one. As ridiculous as Hank Azaria's performance as Gargamel was in those movies, it at least felt somewhat like the character. Whoever's voicing him in this movie sounds like they're just using their normal talking voice. With characters as simple as the ones from the Smurfs, their voice is basically half of what defines them. If you're not even gonna try and replicate it, why even have them in the movie? Maybe Smurfs 2025 will prove me wrong and show that you actually can make a good movie with these characters, but they're batting 0 for 3 so far, so my hopes aren't exactly high. Number 18. The Star. You know, I would actually be all for a movie about Mary and Joseph, and their thoughts and insecurities at being chosen as the earthly parents of the Messiah, because that story actually sounds interesting. Unfortunately, however, in this movie, that's basically relegated to a minor subplot with 1 or 2 scenes. The rest of the runtime is pretty much just a gimmick. It's a bunch of random hijinks with these talking animals, and then every once in a while they'll cut to a familiar scene from the Nativity story for a few seconds, before cutting right back to the random animal hijinks. It's pretty much one of those old straight-to-VHS adaptations of the Nativity they would have you watch in Sunday school, except with a bunch of padding to make it feature-length. Maybe if any of these animal characters were interesting, or if any of their hijinks were fun, I could still get behind the decision, but it's about as gimmicky in execution as it is in concept. None of the comedic set pieces are memorable at all, and their entire input on the Nativity story doesn't go any deeper than, wow, I sure don't get what's happening, but it sure does feel important. And this was probably the best out of the 4 movies SPA released in 2017. They really were the studio of slop before Spider-Verse came out. Number 17. Peter Rabbit. Ah, no. Not James Corden again. Is there an actor out there who's more of a death sentence to any potential a movie has of being good? To be utterly fair, this is probably one of the better movies he's been in, but trust me, the bar is not high. Ultimately, it's just the same shit as the live-action Smurfs movies. This is hardly even a movie about Peter Rabbit, it's the generic story about some guy who has to get a promotion at his job, and has to reconcile with someone. They do both stock storylines in one this time, and the fact that the character the movie is named after is even there is pretty much incidental. It's not as egregious in that regard as the Smurfs movies. There were at least 1 or 2 points where the stuff with Peter Rabbit and the stuff with Boring White Guy number 85,000,001 intersected in mildly meaningful ways, and I did kind of like the few small bits where the movie decided to be a bit sincere. Some of these scenes were done in a really nice style, reminiscent of Beatrix Potter's original illustrations, which definitely helped. But it's not enough to counteract how annoying the other parts of the movie can be. I hate that rooster. And that's it. As of now, Sony has made 5 animated live-action hybrids, and by far the best of them is ranked 17 out of 28. Not the best track record. Number 16. Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs 2. I consider this movie to be a pretty textbook example of a bad animated sequel. Honestly, the movie just feels like a throwaway script they had lying around that they retroactively threw the Cloudy with a Chance cast into, because it has pretty much nothing to do with the first movie. Conceptually, thematically, or otherwise. It's just a generic save the rainforest story. The fact that the animals are made out of food doesn't really affect anything. That whole element is only there to make an extremely flimsy connection to the original, and also so they can make a bunch of puns, which gets really grating as the movie goes on. This is another Sony sequel where they retcon the main character's backstory, and have their entire motivation be based around some random idol figure they had as a child, who was never even mentioned in the first movie. And that choice didn't bring anything interesting out of the main character this time either. Pretty much all Flint does the whole movie is mindlessly fanboy. The supporting cast from the first one don't have anything to do in this one either. I guess Earl is still kinda funny, but for every other supporting character, they pretty much just take one of their recurring gags from the first movie, like the dad raising his eyebrows, or Brent saying uh-oh, and spam it. Like, in the first movie, that thing with Brent was set up and then reincorporated once, maybe twice total, while in this movie, he says it in basically every single shot that he's in. Okay, with that, nearly halfway through the list, we are finally done with the movies I consider to be outright bad. Now we can move on to the ones that are merely mediocre. Number 15. Open Season, Scared Silly. Yeah, I'm shocked. I actually thought the fourth Open Season movie was watchable. Even mildly enjoyable in a few parts. I unironically laughed once or twice while watching this one. This fourth movie finally starts to hit the energetic, cartoony tone this franchise has been aiming for all along, and it has a few pretty fun set pieces and recurring gags, the plane scene being a highlight. Plus, the deer is far less insufferable a character this time. The dynamic they give him with the rest of the cast in this one actually kind of works, and his antics do get some moderately enjoyable responses from them. You know, the bare minimum requirements for an in-universe annoying character to work. I can't rank it too highly though, because ultimately, it is still an open season movie. The animation itself may be an improvement over 2 and 3, and maybe even the original, but they are still stuck with the same awful character designs. A lot of the voice acting is still quite weak, and of course, it wouldn't be an open season movie without a shit joke they drag on for what feels like 20 minutes. But with this franchise, as well as with the Sony Marathon in general, I'll take what I can get. Number 14. The Angry Birds Movie 2. I have absolutely no idea why only the sequel was animated by SPA. The first one was released under Sony's umbrella, but I guess some B studio did the animation. I debated about whether I should watch the original movie first, but in the end, I decided that I didn't really care, and that there probably aren't many people that do. I've watched enough shit already for this marathon. That being said, though, Angry Birds 2 was another one where, while I still didn't think it was good, I did enjoy it a lot more than I was expecting to. The character design is a pretty massive improvement over most of the things I've ranked below it, and I did laugh a fair few times, especially during that one bathroom scene. It does feel like the animators had a lot of fun with how this weird puppet thing moved. However, most of the rest of the humor is just a bunch of try-hard attempts at being hip and random, including a bunch of meme references that were probably already outdated when the movie came out in 2019, let alone in 2024, or 5, or whenever this video comes out. I also really did not enjoy the massive chunk of the runtime that was dedicated to these 3 annoying kids, and their subplot that went nowhere and had nothing to do with anything. And of all things, I actually hated the soundtrack in this movie. It consists pretty much entirely of the most obvious, overused songs in movies that you can possibly imagine. Like, I Need a Hero, Eye of the Tiger, Axel F, they're all here, and I swear they play a new one every 30 seconds. And yet, still probably one of the better video game movie adaptations ever made. That bar might be even lower than pre-Spider-Verse Sony. Number 13. Hotel Transylvania 3, Summer Vacation. Hotel Transylvania is a fairly consistent franchise. Even this one, which I would consider to be the weakest of the series, is watchable enough. The character animation is nice and energetic in all of them. All of them have some jokes that are funny, and some that aren't. All of them have some character moments that are nice, and some that I find overly cheesy or sappy. So I guess all there really is to talk about are the minor reasons why I find this one to be slightly weaker than the others. This one probably had the worst ratio of jokes that work and jokes that don't. I think Johnny and Wayne are both kind of underutilized. I pretty consistently found them 2 of the funniest characters throughout the other movies, and this time round, Johnny barely does anything, while Wayne spends most of the runtime locked in a closet. And that entire overly long climactic scene where the Macarena saves the day. Really, could you have picked a lazier joke to use for the set piece that the entire movie's been building to, than using a well-established meme song and an existing silly dance that goes along with it? Might as well just watch Carl Weezer and Shaggy stuck doing the Macarena on YouTube. That's the same level of comedy. I guess there is one minor point Summer Vacation gets over the other movies. one of my biggest gripes with the Hotel Transylvania franchise as a whole is how every movie kind of just feels like a repeat of the first movie, and this third one is probably the one that strays the most from that formula. However, I can't really give it too much credit for that, because it still doesn't differentiate itself that much. The biggest change they made was just swapping the roles of a few characters around, giving Drax's love interest, Erica, and kind of Mavis as well, basically the same arc that they usually give Drax. Anyway, do be prepared for me to potentially repeat myself a bit when talking about the other movies. Number 12. The Mitchells vs. the Machines. This is probably my biggest hot take in this whole video, at least in the negative sense. It does have a really cool animation style, but that's pretty much the only thing I especially liked about it. I thought it was too long for what's essentially a road trip comedy. The villain is pretty lame. They give one somewhat interesting speech near the beginning of the movie, but after that, they're pretty much the most milquetoast, evil AI you could possibly imagine. The humor felt like it was trying way too hard to pander to the internet crowd, where a lot of the time the joke was just cat filters, or the mere fact that certain social media sites exist. I guess the emotional core of the movie was meant to be the relationship between the main girl and her dad, and parts of that worked, but I found a lot of it to be really cheesy and on the nose. And then they try and make self-aware comments about how it's all so on the nose, but that doesn't automatically make it not on the nose. You still had that scene where the girl spent basically an entire minute blatantly listing out the themes of the movie. Also, I hate the voice acting for the younger brother. He's supposed to be, what, 8, 9? Why does he sound like a fucking 40-year-old? He doesn't even seem like he's trying to sound like a kid. The disconnect between his design and his voice is so jarring. I don't know if I could name a worse casting choice for any voice acting role. Chris Pratt as Mario was a better casting choice than this. Number 11. Hotel Transylvania 2. Quite frankly, there's not much between Hotel Transylvania 2 and 3, and I was almost thinking about doing the same thing I did with the live-action Smurfs movies, and knocking them both out in one entry, but I decided I did enjoy this one a bit more than both the third movie and the Mitchells vs. the Machines. There were a few more jokes that I thought were funny, and a few less that I thought fell flat. Drax's arc in this one is largely a repeat of his arc from the first movie. The only difference is it's with his grandson instead of his son-in-law, but at least they kind of acknowledge that and make his apparent inability to hold on to the lessons he's learned part of his character a bit. One of the only other things I have in my notes is that I think that climactic battle where the humans and monsters team up against those weird bat things, which is supposed to be the turning point that completes the grandfather's arc, could have been a bit more effective if the humans weren't so useless the entire time. They let Johnny take out one, and that's literally it. I am grasping at straws with that, though. I wish there was more to comment on, but I'd just be repeating myself. It's like I said already, this series is really consistent. There is one more thing I have to mention, though. This isn't really a criticism or an appraisal, it's just something I first noticed while watching this movie. But I do find it pretty funny that, even in their animated movies, Sony just can't help themselves with the phone and laptop product placement. Number 10. Vivo. Yes, we are in the top 10 out of nearly 30 movies, and we are still only on the ones that I gave a 5. Because while Vivo does have a few things going for it, namely the parts that were actually focused on the old guy and the song he wrote for this woman, their story is sweet. I quite like the visual style in these scenes, and the way it concluded was honestly pretty emotionally effective. However, that only makes up a pretty small percentage of the runtime, a bit at the beginning and a bit at the end. There's well over an hour of stuff in between that I didn't find a whole lot to enjoy in. The main kid is kind of annoying, these other kids are really annoying, the songs vary in quality, and a lot of them don't convey anything important, plot or character-wise. And also, this is a minor thing, but sometimes it does feel like Lin-Manuel Miranda is tooting his own horn a bit. There are a few parts in the movie where his character comments on the importance and meaning of the main song, a song that, you know, he wrote. The movie's fine, overall, but I feel like it would have been a lot better if it was just about these two. Number 9. Hotel Transylvania Transformania. Yeah, the general consensus with the Hotel Transylvania sequels seems to be that they progressively get worse with each new entry, but honestly, Transformania was probably my favorite sequel. It does get kinda grating watching Drac have to repeat the same arc again, and this might be the one that treads the most familiar ground with the original, but all of the sequels are, in one way or another, kind of a repeat of that first movie. So I really think that what it comes down to is, which one is the best executed repeat of the first movie? And ultimately, I found this one more consistently funny than the other sequels. Turning them all into humans was a good gimmick. I did really enjoy Mavis and Erica's team-up. Clearly, Erica has developed a lot more after one previous movie than Drac has after 3. And hey, at least this time round, Drac tried to admit to his wrongdoings before he got caught in the lie. He didn't succeed, but he tried. I don't know if they're planning on making any more of these. The director of the first 3 movies was less involved in this one, and a few cast members have left by now as well, but I didn't mind its run as SPA's flagship series. It was certainly way better at being that than Open Season was. One more thing, though. Do you remember that weird mini-controversy over this movie when the Invisible Man's appearance was revealed and certain individuals got upset that he wasn't secretly hot? I've got a solution to offer those people. Dracula became pudgier and balder when he turned human, right? Well, you can just pretend the same thing happened to the Invisible Man. There, problem solved. Number 8. Wish Dragon. The main thing I'd heard about this movie before going in is that it was fine, but kind of just a retelling of the Aladdin story, and for the first chunk of the runtime, that's pretty much what I got out of it. There were some moderately funny jokes, but it wasn't exactly making me laugh out loud. The animation was far from the worst I'd ever seen, but it did have that kinda cheap, straight-to-streaming look. And honestly, a lot of the voice acting, particularly for the minor supporting characters, was not great. So, for a while, I wasn't really that into it. However, around halfway through the movie, it actually subverts the Aladdin story by having the main character admit pretty early on that he's not really a prince, or rather the contemporary equivalent they use, and the plot goes in a more interesting direction from there. I find it kinda nice that a large chunk of the runtime is spent on the 2 leads enjoying each other's company without the caveat that their relationship is built on a lie. They also spend the extra time they provided themselves giving the titular genie equivalent an unexpected level of depth, and without being too specific, this character makes a sacrifice at the end that they don't cop out of. He really comes into his own as a character rather than just being a snobbish version of the Robin Williams genie. It is possible that I'm slightly overrating this one, just by virtue of it being a pleasant surprise. I should make it clear that I still don't especially like this movie. It lacks a lot of polish, and much of it is still kinda generic, but it functions. Number 6. Hotel Transylvania. And no, that wasn't a mistake, I'm talking about number 6 before I talk about number 7. I'll explain in a second. So, the original Hotel Transylvania. It's alright. It was a solid start to a franchise that remained pretty serviceable throughout its later entries, hence why all 4 of them ranked within only a few spots of each other. It's got all of the positives that the sequels had, including and especially the really nice, energetic character animation, and I think it has less of the negatives. Even ignoring the fact that this time, it doesn't have the caveat that he's already had the same arc several times before, this is probably the best executed version of Drac's arc, and the most understandable his actions have felt. He and Johnny have a fun dynamic in this one as well, and as a matter of fact, these 2 characters having a lot of screen time together again is another reason I enjoyed the 4th movie the most out of the sequels. I'd say overall, Hotel Transylvania is a very does-what-it-says-on-the-tin franchise. It looks like a moderately funny, family-friendly comedy with a bunch of references to classic monster movies, and that's pretty much exactly what you get. Number 7 and 5. The Aardman collaborations. The Pirates in an Adventure with Scientists, or Band of Misfits depending on your country, at number 7, and Arthur Christmas at number 5. I'm not saying too much about these 2 in this video. I am planning on giving Aardman Animation its own video at some point in the near future, and I'd prefer to talk about these there, not only because I associate them more with Aardman than I do with SPA, but also to make sure I have enough movies to talk about in that video. Even including their collaborations with other studios, the amount of films they've made is considerably smaller. To put it super briefly, I feel very similarly about The Pirates and the original Hotel Transylvania, but I think Hotel Transylvania just edges it out because I find it a bit more consistently funny. Rather annoyingly, if I'm honest, because as a result, I was forced to either have two separate interjections about Aardman, or talk about my ranking out of order. Meanwhile, Arthur Christmas, it's not like the bar is super high, but it's definitely one of the better Christmas movies out there. And also definitely the better out of the 2 times Aardman has attempted CG animation. Stay tuned for the Aardman ranking coming sometime. Number 4. Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. This is a pretty textbook example of a concept movie. It has the pretty unique, but fairly simple, easy to market idea of town where it rains food, and as long as the final product is polished enough, the execution hardly even matters. Thankfully, in this instance, the execution was still quite good anyway. Seriously, why is the score for this movie so epic? There are plenty of other things to like about the movie. Like the Hotel Transylvania series, the exaggerated character animation and facial expressions are a lot of fun. Protagonist Flint has some really nice moments with his dad, and it has a very memorable supporting cast, especially Earl, who pretty expertly walks a fine line between being an over-the-top caricature and a genuine badass. But that score, it really makes you feel like you're witnessing the most important and amazing sequence of events that has ever taken place. This still isn't quite in the circle of movies that I'd actively go out of my way to rewatch very often, but it's an enjoyable time whenever I do. Number 3. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. The animation in this movie is absolutely insane. In the first movie, they lightly touched on the idea of every dimension having a different art style and color palette, and they cranked that up to 1,000,000 in this one. There are so many different art and animation styles, and it gets so visually noisy, but in a way that works. That climactic action scene, where like 200 different Spider-Men are chasing Miles through Nueva York, with all kinds of crazy angles and locations, and there can be dozens of characters on screen at the same time, but somehow they manage to keep it coherent. I don't even know how one would begin to storyboard something like that. If you were to rank every animated movie ever made based purely on the effort and expertise that went into the animation itself, this one might be on top. At the very least, it'd be pretty close to it. But I do have to say, in just about every other way, I did like the first one better. I tended to prefer the simplicity and completeness of Into the Spider-Verse, while in Across the Spider-Verse, they introduced so many more elements to the story that it's borderline overwhelming. And it doesn't really have a beginning or ending, it's just middle all the way through. Also, this is very much a me thing, but I'm just not able to fully buy into the whole canon events thing that a large portion of the plot is built on. It's a pretty common gripe that I have with a lot of sci-fi and fantasy movies where the whole conflict is based around pretty arbitrary rules that the writers just made up. I want to do this. No, because that would be breaking canon. Why can't we break canon? Because the world will end. Why will that happen? I don't fucking know, it just will. And even ignoring that, I don't feel like the movie gives me that great an idea regarding what actually makes something a canon event. What made Miles' dimension so special that it was able to break canon all on its own? It wasn't interdimensional interference that caused them to make that collider in the first place, was it? And why is Miles' dad being killed by the villain considered a canon event? But Miles becoming Spider-Man in the first place, and the mere existence of that villain are both considered anomalies. When you open that can of worms, and it's not explained in a way that makes sense to me, my mind kind of gets stuck on it, and it does sour the experience a little bit for me. I do like the movie, I gave it a high score and I ranked it near the top of this list, but aside from a few great scenes and character moments, I like it in kind of a pure animated action comedy spectacle sort of way. While the 2 movies I've ranked above it, I tend to be more genuinely invested in. Who knows? This is only half the story. Maybe when part 2 eventually comes out, it'll address all of my criticisms in a satisfactory way, but for now, those are my thoughts. Number 2. Surf's Up. This is certainly one of the more unique movies, not just on this list, but in general. I don't know if I can think of another example of an animated mockumentary, and they're pretty faithful to the style. The camera shakes, they tend to avoid impossible angles or movements. Some shots just look like live-action footage that they animated over. And it's not just the way it's shot. They also have things like awkward pauses, or characters talking over one another, giving the dialogue a kind of naturalistic feel, and a lot of editing choices you would usually only see in documentaries. These stylistic choices and the kind of absurd premise are often used to poke fun at documentaries and sports movies, or to cast a layer of irony over parts of the movie so that the more ridiculous or on-the-nose characters and story elements are more easily forgiven. But it's not just used as a crutch. It does a great job at helping you more easily buy into the characters and their plights. It makes them feel somewhat real, despite the fact that they're obviously a bunch of animated penguins, and whenever the movie wants to be sincere, it commits. Big Z is genuinely a great character. He's really funny and charismatic, Jeff Bridges gives a really good voice performance, his dynamic with Cody is a lot of fun, basically any scene with these two is gold, and they actually give him a different, I would say more interesting backstory than the bog-standard forced out of the game due to injury thing they usually give the mentor character in every other sports movie. He's basically a sore loser. He used to be a living legend, and when he couldn't live up to the legend anymore, instead of facing it, he just faked his death and shut himself away. A character's backstory being based around something they did, or a choice they made, rather than something that just happened to them, is pretty much always more interesting to me. I still wouldn't call it an amazing movie. Some elements of the second act fallout feel kinda forced, and some of the humor does feel kinda pandering. That random tribe in the forest is the main example that comes to mind. But it's definitely a gem amongst the slop that SPA used to produce in their early years. Number 1. I mean, what else could it even be? It's Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. It serves as a fantastic meta-commentary on the superhero subgenre, while at the same time in and of itself being possibly the best superhero movie of all time. And just about every individual element of the movie reflects that. I love the character introductions that are humorously written with the conceit that we've heard this Spider-Man origin story time after time already, that at the same time do a great job at letting us know these characters and where they're at in life. I love the way things are constantly reincorporated, both for the sake of comedy and for dramatic purposes, especially that leap of faith line. I love the way it's not just a comedy broken up by action, or an action broken up by comedy. Both the action and the comedy are happening concurrently. The character Peter B. Parker in general suits this tone pretty perfectly. It'd be very easy to have a character like him, the schlubby, middle-aged loser Spider-Man, be a total joke, and they do play him for laughs at many points, but he's genuinely a great character at the same time. His relationship with Miles is really endearing, and his sarcastic remarks about the tropier elements of the story both serve the satirical commentary aspect of the movie, while also playing into his arc as the jaded, cynical veteran Spider-Man who needs his passion for his role to be reignited. Also, it hardly even needs to be mentioned further. I did already spend half of the section on its sequel gushing about it, but the animation. I think Spider-Verse holds the rare honor of being great while also actually having a positive influence on the industry. While it wasn't the first movie that used the capped frame rate CG style, as at least the Lego Movie came out first, it was most likely the movie that popularized it. And in the few years since it came out, we've already seen several more movies that did great things with this animation technique. I have some mild criticisms, like, I think Miles' relationship with his uncle could have had a bit more screen time. I'm not sure I feel the full emotional impact when they've just introduced this whole other side to his character, but then he's quickly killed off in the next scene he's in. But it is looking like this might be addressed in the upcoming third movie, so we'll have to wait and see. Regardless, as of now, I think Spider-Verse is the best movie that Sony Pictures Animation has ever released, and is my personal choice for the best superhero movie ever made. Well, that was a pretty tough marathon to get through, but at least there were a few gems. I guess now is as good a time as ever to look at SPA's upcoming projects. 2 of them are pretty much just names at this point. They're both new IPs, and I'm personally not familiar with any of the people behind them, so there isn't much that drives my expectations one way or the other. I'm assuming GOAT will have something to do with basketball, because Stephen Curry is a producer, and I think he plays for the NBA or something. I don't know, I don't watch it. I'm more interested in the other 2. There's Fixed, which is supposedly an adult comedy directed by Genndy Tartakovsky, who I've heard is kind of an animation legend. I didn't love the Hotel Transylvania series, which he also directed, but they were enjoyable enough, and I personally haven't seen any of his TV shows like Dexter's Laboratory, Samurai Jack, Primal, or that Star Wars thing, but I've heard good things. Then, of course, there's Beyond the Spider-Verse. Even ignoring the fact that Across the Spider-Verse ended on a cliffhanger, so of course I'm interested in seeing how that gets resolved. This is the 3rd movie in a trilogy, and I don't know whether they're going to make any more after this one, but the implication of that is usually that this is going to be the climax. The action and animation in Across the Spider-Verse is already some of the craziest I've ever seen, so I don't know whether they're going to try and somehow top it, or if they'll think they can't and go in a completely different direction. Either way, really curious to see what they'll do. Anyway, that's it, my voice is dead, and I hope you enjoyed. The next studio I'm planning on covering for this series is Nickelodeon, one that I don't think too many people have made videos on, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, goodbye.